If I were to ask you this morning, if you have something that you're grateful for, what would it be? Could you get up and give a testimony about what you're thankful for as we come into this Thanksgiving season? If I were to ask you this morning if you're satisfied with what you have. Now, it's one thing to be thankful for what you have. It's something else to be satisfied with what you have. A lot of people can say, well, yeah, I'm thankful for this, that, and the other thing. But if I were honest, I'm not satisfied yet. If I were to ask you this morning, who is your greatest opponent in life? How would you answer that question? Who is your greatest opponent in life? Is it a political enemy? Is it a business enemy? Is it an enemy on the job? Is it somebody in your own family? Would you say, I am my greatest enemy? Or would you say, well, no, Satan and his minions, his demons, they are my greatest enemy? Who is our ultimate opponent in life? Who is it that keeps us from getting from being who it is that we should be, that God made us to be? Join me, would you please, in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. Genesis 32, 22, as we look at the life of one of the patriarchs, Jacob. Remember, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Interesting guy. We've been looking at his life, and we continue here in verse 32. It says, that night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. Now, little background here. Jacob's been away for 20 years, away from home, and he's coming back home. When he left, he was by himself. He had nothing but a staff in his hand. Now he is a wealthy man. He's got flocks, herds. He has a large family. God promised to bless him 20 years earlier, and he has in that respect. And while he was away, he became a wealthy man. When he left 20 years ago, his older twin brother Esau was so angry with him that he was ready to murder his younger brother. And that was one of the reasons that he left and he stayed away these 20 years. And now that he's come back, remember, since there's no Facebook or texting or anything else, there's no way for him to know what his brother's attitude is. He's done his version of send a text to his brother, which is he sent some of his servants out there, and they came back and said, your brother's coming to meet you, and he's coming with 400 men. Well, that didn't sound good. It sounded like his brother was still angry with him. And so Jacob spends the night here after praying, by the way, and after preparing to meet his brother. But it seems like he's a little restless, and he sends his family and his possessions across this Jabbok River, which is a tributary flowing into the Jordan River about 15 miles north of the Dead Sea. And it comes sharply down through some deep-cut canyons. It's a rugged part of the country. And this is before artificial lighting, remember? And so to try to cross the river at night was risky business. So he's very restless. And he does this anyway. And look what happens here. In verse 24 it says, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched, and he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And the man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. And the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome. And Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. And look at verse 30. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, yet my life was spared. Who did Jacob wrestle with that night? We can study this text and study it. We can study it in the original language. We can study it in other languages that it was translated into. We can analyze the grammar. We can look at it upside down, backwards, forwards, inside and out, and you never quite get a satisfactory answer. Some people say, well, the person struggling with Jacob couldn't overcome him, well, how could that possibly be God? It must just be an angel that he struggled with. Others say, well, it must be the angel of God, the angel of Yahweh that we read about so often, especially in the book of Genesis. But at the end of the day, nobody really knows for sure who it is that Jacob struggled with. Perhaps we should just ask Jacob. After all, he was there. His opinion matters for something, doesn't it? Maybe Jacob knows better than all the theologians who have come and gone in the thousands of years since then, because he's the one that actually put his hands on this man, whoever it was, and rolled around on the ground and struggled with him and fought with him until the dawn was coming up. And Jacob's opinion is, his eyewitness account is, that he struggled with and saw face to face God. Well, how can that be? How can that be? How can God be a man? The more we ponder this, the more we realize that what's happening here is Jacob is getting a shaft of theological light that shoots toward the New Testament. Actually, what we're seeing here is a little echo ahead of time of what happened at Christmas. Where Jacob is getting a hands-on idea of something about God that would not be fully revealed for more than 1,000 years after he wrestled with that man that night. God was slowly turning back the veil that covered heaven and covered his face. Just a little at a time. He was showing more and more and more of who he is, and this was one of those times. And Jacob just happened to be the one who was there to get that. Jacob learned that God was there in flesh. Well, that's an incredibly New Testament kind of revelation about God. Only when we get to the New Testament do we come to Bethlehem and realize that God became flesh. Only when we get to the New Testament do we read that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt for a while among us. Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a man, being found in human likeness. This is the distinctive Christian revelation about who God is, that God condescended and took on flesh so that we could relate to him. Why did God appear to Jacob as a man? Let's ask and answer a couple of questions about this text this morning. Would you get your bulletin out, turn it over, get a pencil or a pen? There's some fascinating questions in this text. This is a great text. Certain biblical texts just seem to be mountaintops throughout the Bible. And in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, without a doubt, this is one of them. And the first question that we ask is, why did God appear as a man? And the answer to that is really quite simple. Jacob could relate better to God in the flesh. Jacob could relate better to God in the flesh. Is it even possible for those of us who are Christians, particularly those of us who have been raised in the church, could we erase from our mind and our heart the idea of Bethlehem? The idea of Jesus walking the dusty roads between Galilee and Jerusalem. Jesus in the temple. Jesus on the cross. Jesus in the tomb, resurrected. Could we erase all of that from our minds and our hearts and try to get back to an Old Testament understanding of God as transcendent, as out of sight, out of mind? In fact, so scary that they believed in the Old Testament to see God was to die. You cannot see the face of God and live. He is so holy, so exalted, so magnificent. If we could get back to that thinking about God, erase the idea of what we call the incarnation, then we would see how utterly otherworldly it was for them to consider God, and to think that God would become man so that he could relate to us, to Jacob, was a a computer scientist. He did whatever made him happy. Part of that was having a lot of girlfriends. He and his brother were in the Caribbean when he was in his mid-20s, and he saw a girl that was cute. He went to pick her up, found out she was an American, but there was a problem. This girl from New York City, who was so cute that he wanted to pick up and sleep with, believed in God. Well, that was a problem for him. To him, GM considered that to be intellectual suicide. What was even worse, though, is she believed that sex was for marriage. And that was a big stopperoo for GM, okay? But GM really loved this girl. He had fallen for her. So she went home to New York, he went home to Paris, and they stayed in touch and dated when they could. And he decided, I need to disabuse this woman of these foolish notions about God. How can I do that? Well, first of all, I need to understand what she believes so that I can debunk it. And so he picked up a Bible and he actually prayed. He said, God, if you're out there, here I am, talk to me. And he began to read the Bible. Well, almost immediately, his shoulder no longer worked. His shoulder stopped working. No more volleyball on the weekends. He went to the doctor couldn't figure out what was wrong. All they could do is tell him, just stop playing volleyball for a while. So suddenly he had nothing to do on Sunday. So he thought, well, I'll go to one of these strange churches where this girl goes and try to figure out what these people are all about. He went with the attitude of somebody going to a zoo. You know, I'm going to go see something that I read about in the book and I've never seen before. So he goes to a church and he decided, I'll ask the pastor and see if he can explain it to me. Cut to the chase, and began to meet with the pastor, and the pastor surprised him with some of the answers that he gave him. It scared him. It scared him because he began to think, well, what if all of this is true? And then the turning point for Jim, he says, this is a surprise, he said, the turning point for me was that God reactivated my conscience. And he had done something that he was ashamed of, and suddenly it was painful. And all of a sudden he understood why Jesus had died for his sins, and he became a Christian. He gave his life to Christ. A French atheist became an evangelical Christian. It doesn't happen very often. It's an unusual story. So he thought, well, surely God wants me to marry this girl. She led me to Christ. So he moved to New York, and they dated and realized that they really couldn't stand each other. So that was the end of that part of the story. So here he is in New York City with nothing to do. So he begins to read, voraciously reading about this new Christianity that he's embraced, book after book, after book after book. And he finally realized, if I'm going to read all these books, I might as well get credit for it. So he enrolls in seminary and ends up with a master's in theology and then begins to work on a PhD in philosophical theology. He must be a smart guy. A French atheist becomes an evangelical theologian. Unusual story. But here's what GM says. He says, God broke down my defenses. God struggled, wrestled with GM, and brought him to Matt. I'm sure GM's happy he did. Sometimes God's a wrestler. Who is your greatest opponent today? Would you bow your heads with me?